It was a crisp autumn morning in the peaceful suburb of Pine Valley, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched for miles and luxury cars dotted every driveway. Officer James Sullivan sat in his patrol car, sipping his third coffee of the day while scanning the streets he'd watched over for the past 15 years. He took pride in knowing every face, every car, and every routine in this wealthy neighborhood, a place where home prices started at 7 figures and residents paid good money to feel safe. As Sullivan turned onto Maple Drive, something caught his attention. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing expensive running shoes and professional athleisure wear, was walking with purpose while checking her phone. She carried a leather briefcase and had the confident air of someone who knew exactly where they were going. But Sullivan had never seen her before, and in his mind, that was reason enough for suspicion. He slowed his patrol car, watching as she turned into the driveway of the Johnsons' old house, a stunning colonial that had been on the market for months. The woman reached into her pocket, pulled out a key, and headed toward the front door. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors about the house being sold, but surely not to. Pulling his car to the curb, he stepped out, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning quiet. "I'm going to need you to step away from that property." Dr. Michelle Carter turned, her hand still on the door handle, and offered a polite smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, professional, the same tone she used in her operating room when things got tense. "This is a private residence," Sullivan stated, moving closer. "I'm going to need to see some identification and proof that you have permission to be here." "Of course," Dr. Carter replied, reaching for her wallet. "I just moved in yesterday. I'm the new owner." She held out her driver's license and a copy of her closing documents, but Sullivan barely glanced at them. "Right," he said, skepticism dripping from his voice. "And I suppose you just happened to buy this $3 million house all by yourself." He made no effort to hide his disbelief, eyes narrowing as he looked from the papers to her face. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, maintaining her composure even as her heart rate picked up. She'd dealt with this kind of treatment before, but never at her own front door. "Officer, I'm a neurosurgeon at Metropolitan Hospital. I'd assure you this is my home. I have every right to be here." Neighbors began peeking through their windows, some stepping onto their porches to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen from next door started recording with her phone, her morning gardening forgotten, as she witnessed the interaction. A neurosurgeon. Sullivan scoffed, handing back her documents with barely concealed disdain. "Let's see some hospital ID then. And I'm going to need you to step away from the door while I verify all this." "Officer, I've provided sufficient identification, including proof of residence." "I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal on my own property," Dr. Carter stated firmly, though her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. She knew what came next. She'd seen it too many times before. Sullivan's face hardened at her resistance. In his mind, her confidence only proved her defiance of his authority. "Ma'am, if you can't comply with my simple requests, we're going to have a problem. Put your hands where I can see them." The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as more neighbors gathered, their whispers growing louder. They watched as a respected surgeon stood her ground against an officer whose judgment was clouded by prejudice, neither of them knowing that this moment would spark a chain of events that would change not just their lives, but their entire community. Dr. Carter's phone kept recording as Officer Sullivan's demeanor grew increasingly aggressive. She'd learned long ago to document everything, a habit that had served her well through medical school and now as a homeowner in Pine Valley. Her fingers were steady as she held the phone, even as her heart raced against her ribcage. "I'm only going to say this one more time," Sullivan barked, his hand resting on his belt. "Step away from the door and put your hands where I can see them." The morning breeze carried his words across the perfectly trimmed lawn, where a small crowd of neighbors had gathered. "Officer, I want to be clear. Dr. Carter spoke with the same measured tone she used when explaining complex procedures to nervous patients. I am standing on my property, which I legally purchased. I've shown you my identification and proof of ownership. Your continued harassment is unwarranted. Mrs. Chen, still recording from her rose garden next door, stepped forward. Officer Sullivan, she's telling the truth. This is our new neighbor. I met her yesterday when the moving truck came. Several other neighbors nodded in agreement, their morning routines forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. But Sullivan wasn't listening. In his 15 years on the force, he developed what he called instincts, what others might recognize as deeply rooted prejudices. The sight of Dr. Carter's calm defiance, her professional attire, and her well-spoken manner only seemed to aggravate him further. "Ma'am, your attitude is becoming a problem," he announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer." The collective gasps from the neighbors seemed to hang in the morning air. Dr. Carter's phone was still recording as Sullivan roughly grabbed her wrist, causing her to drop her briefcase. Medical papers scattered across the dewy grass, surgical schedules, patient files, and the mornings or plans spreading like fallen leaves. "I'd want everyone to note that I am complying under protest," Dr. Carter announced clearly, her voice carrying to all the recording phones around her. "I am being arrested in front of my own home after providing legal documentation of my residence." As Sullivan tightened the handcuffs, Mr. Thompson from across the street stepped forward, his morning newspaper forgotten in his hand. "This is ridiculous, Sullivan. She's the neurosurgeon who operated on my wife last month. She saved her life." But Sullivan was already reciting the Miranda rights, his voice mechanical and practiced. He seemed oblivious to the growing number of neighbors recording the incident, or perhaps he simply didn't care. To him, this was just another day of what he called protecting the neighborhood. As he led Dr. Carter to his patrol car, she held her head high, dignity intact despite the circumstances. The neighbors weren't just recording anymore, they were making calls. To the police department, to local news stations, to their friends on the neighborhood association board. Mrs. Chen quickly gathered the scattered medical papers, her gardening gloves still on. "Don't worry, doctor," she called out. "We all saw everything. We'll take care of this." She waved her phone, where the recording was still running. From the back of the patrol car, Dr. Carter watched her new neighbors through the window. She saw their outrage, their phones raised high, their voices rising in protest. In her 20 years of medicine, she'd faced discrimination before, but never quite like this. As Sullivan started the car, she closed her eyes briefly, centered herself, and made a decision. This incident wouldn't end with just another complaint filed and forgotten. This time, she would turn it into something meaningful, something that could create real change. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed by what they'd witnessed. Little did Officer Sullivan know, his actions that morning wouldn't just result in another internal affairs investigation. They would spark a transformation that would ripple through the entire community, starting with his own understanding of the world. Within hours of Dr. Carter's arrest, the police station's phones wouldn't stop ringing. The video had spread faster than wildfire through social media, and news vans were already parked outside the precinct. Inside, Police Chief Richardson sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he watched the footage for the third time. "Over 4 million views in 3 hours, he muttered, looking at the trending numbers on his computer screen. The headline above the video read, "Renowned surgeon arrested in front of her own home." His email inbox was flooded with messages from reporters, civil rights organizations, and even the hospital board where Dr. Carter worked. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter sat calmly in a conference room, surrounded by her colleagues from Metropolitan Hospital who had rushed to the station the moment they heard. The hospital's legal team had arrived within minutes of her call, and the charges were dropped almost immediately. "We should make an example of this," one of the lawyers suggested, spreading documents across the table. Clear civil rights violations, unlawful arrest, racial profiling. We could win this case easily. But Dr. Carter was looking at a different set of papers in front of her. Her years of experience handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to see beyond immediate reactions. "I have a different proposal," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent as she explained her idea. Instead of a lawsuit, she wanted to establish a mandatory program, one that would address the root cause of what happened that morning. The other doctors exchanged skeptical glances, but they knew that look in her eyes. It was the same determination they'd seen when she tackled seemingly impossible surgeries. Across the building, Officer Sullivan sat alone in an empty break room, watching his career crumble around him. Administrative leave was just the beginning. He knew there would be an investigation, maybe even worse. His phone kept buzzing with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others disappointed. The weight of his actions was finally starting to sink in. Chief Richardson's voice cut through his thoughts. "Officer Sullivan, Dr. Carter would like to speak with you." Sullivan's head snapped up. "Sir?" "She's declining to press charges," the chief continued, "but she has a condition. She wants to talk, and you're going to listen." The walk to the conference room felt like the longest of Sullivan's life. Each step echoed with the weight of his choices, his assumptions, his biases. When he opened the door, he expected to see an angry woman ready to tear into him. Instead, he found Dr. Carter sitting alone at the table, 2 cups of coffee in front of her. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We need to have an honest conversation about what happened this morning, and more importantly, about what happens next." Sullivan hesitated before taking the seat. The coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand as he lifted it. The steam rising between them seemed to blur the lines of authority and prejudice that had seemed so clear to him just hours ago. "I've been doing some research," Dr. Carter began, opening a folder. "Did you know that Metropolitan Hospital has a community outreach program? We pair medical professionals with law enforcement officers for a unique kind of cultural exchange. It's been quite successful in other districts." Sullivan's confusion was evident. "I don't understand. Why aren't you suing me? You have every right to." Dr. Carter leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. "Because, Officer Sullivan, lawsuits might win damages, but they rarely change hearts. What happened this morning wasn't just about you and me. It's about patterns that need to be broken, assumptions that need to be challenged, and bridges that need to be built." She slid a document across the table. "This is my proposal. Instead of a lawsuit, I want you to participate in our program. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity for real change. The choice is yours." As Sullivan stared at the paper before him, the precinct bustled around them, unaware that in this quiet conference room, a remarkable transformation was about to begin. One that would eventually reshape not just 2 lives, but an entire community's approach to understanding and respect. The community center's meeting room felt smaller than usual as Officer Sullivan walked in for the first mediation session. The walls, covered with colorful posters about unity and understanding, seemed to mock his presence. He tugged at his collar, uncomfortable in civilian clothes. It was the first time in years he'd gone somewhere without his uniform. Dr. Carter was already there, sitting beside the mediator, a gentle-faced woman with gray hair who had decades of experience bringing people together. The table between them held water bottles, notepads, and an uncomfortable amount of silence. "Let's start at the beginning," the mediator suggested, her voice warm but professional. "Officer Sullivan, could you tell us about where you grew up?" Sullivan shifted in his chair, his coffee cup providing a convenient distraction. "Small town up north," he began hesitantly. "Pine Hills. Everyone knew everyone. It was different back then." He paused, realizing how that sounded. "Simpler, I mean." "Could you elaborate on simpler?" The mediator pressed gently. Sullivan stared into his coffee. My dad was a cop too. Third generation. We lived in the same neighborhood his parents did. Same people, same traditions, same everything. His voice trailed off as memories surfaced. Sunday dinners where certain views went unchallenged. Jokes that he now realized weren't really jokes at all. Dr. Carter listened intently, her notepad untouched. She'd heard similar stories before, but something about Sullivan's honesty caught her attention. When did you first interact with people different from your community? She asked. Police academy, he admitted. But by then, I guess I already had certain ways of thinking. The words felt heavy in his mouth. My training officer used to say we should trust our instincts. But maybe what I thought were instincts were really just learned behaviors, the mediator suggested softly. Sullivan nodded, unable to meet their eyes. I remember my first patrol. Every call, every stop, every decision. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But now, he gestured helplessly at the air between them. Dr. Carter pulled out some papers from her bag. I brought something I'd like to share, she said. These are letters from my patients. People whose lives were in my hands, who never questioned my ability because of how I look. She spread them on the table. Heartfelt thanks from people of all backgrounds, united by the trust they placed in her skills. This one, she pointed to a particularly worn letter, is from a police officer's wife. I operated on her after a car accident. Her husband hugged me after the surgery, crying, calling me a hero. She looked directly at Sullivan. He never once doubted that I belonged in that operating room. Sullivan picked up one of the letters, his hands slightly shaking. I have a daughter, he said suddenly. She wants to be a doctor. She's so smart, works so hard. If someone treated her the way I treated you. The mediator watched as understanding dawned on his face. Sometimes, the hardest truths came from the simplest realizations. Tell me about your daughter, Dr. Carter encouraged, her voice gentle. What made her want to become a doctor? As Sullivan began to talk about his daughter's dreams, her determination, her passion for helping others, something in the room shifted. The walls didn't feel quite so close anymore. The posters didn't seem to mock, but to encourage. You know, he said, pausing mid-story, she'd be horrified if she knew what I did. She's always been better than me at seeing people for who they are. A tear he couldn't hold back slipped down his cheek. I want to be the kind of father she deserves. Dr. Carter reached across the table, not with a handshake, but offering a tissue. That's why we're here, she said. Not to tear down, but to build up, to learn, to grow, to change. The mediator smiled quietly, watching as two people, divided by a lifetime of experiences and assumptions, began to find common ground in their shared humanity. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows, but in that room, something new was dawning. The first real step toward understanding. 2 weeks had passed since the first mediation session, and Officer Sullivan found himself standing in the bustling lobby of Metropolitan Hospital. The familiar weight of his badge was missing. He was still on administrative leave, but today he carried something different, a visitor's pass that read, Community Program Participant. Dr. Carter met him by the information desk, already dressed in her surgical scrubs. Ready for your first day of shadowing? She asked, her tone professional but encouraging. Sullivan nodded, trying to hide his nervousness as hospital staff hurried past them, some giving curious glances. First, we'll attend the morning rounds, she explained, leading him through the crowded hallways. Then you'll observe how our team works together during consultations. Think of it as getting to know a different kind of patrol. The elevator ride to the neurology floor was quiet until Sullivan broke the silence. My daughter asked about you last night, he said. She saw the video online. She wants to apply for an internship here next summer. Dr. Carter's expression softened. The student program is quite competitive, but we always need dedicated young people. Had she started her application? Before Sullivan could answer, the elevator doors opened to organized chaos. Doctors rushed past with charts, nurses called out vital signs, and somewhere, a monitor beeped steadily. It was a different kind of emergency response than what Sullivan was used to, but he recognized the controlled urgency. "Morning rounds," Dr. Carter announced, grabbing a tablet. "Pay attention to how we communicate. Lives depend on our ability to work together, trust each other, and look past everything except what matters, saving our patients." Sullivan watched as Dr. Carter led her team through patient updates. She moved with confidence between rooms, speaking to patients of all backgrounds with the same compassion and expertise. Some were business executives, others were factory workers, but in these halls, they all received the same level of care. "Mrs. Rodriguez needs another MRI," Dr. Carter instructed her team. "And Mr. Chin's family will be here at noon to discuss his recovery plan." She turned to Sullivan. "Notice anything about our morning so far?" Sullivan thought carefully. Everyone works together seamlessly. No one questions anyone's authority or expertise based on how they look. "Exactly," she replied. "In medicine, we can't afford those kinds of biases. They cost lives." The morning flew by, and soon they were sitting in the hospital cafeteria. Sullivan pushed his food around his plate, deep in thought. "You know," he finally said, "I keep thinking about all the times I've made assumptions on patrol. How many times I might have been wrong." Dr. Carter put down her fork. "That's why this program exists. It's not about making you feel guilty. It's about opening eyes to new perspectives." Their lunch was interrupted by an urgent page. "Emergency consultation," Dr. Carter said, standing quickly. "Coming. This is where it gets real." They rushed to the ER where a young patient had arrived with a severe head injury. Sullivan watched in amazement as Dr. Carter took charge of the situation. The same woman he had handcuffed weeks ago was now commanding a room full of medical professionals, making split-second decisions that would save a life. "BP dropping," a nurse called out. "Get me a CT scan stat," Dr. Carter ordered, her voice clear and confident. "We need to check for intracranial bleeding." Hours later, after the patient was stabilized, Sullivan sat in the consultation room, processing what he'd witnessed. "I never really understood," he admitted. "When I saw you at your house that day, I only saw what I expected to see. I never thought about the lives you save, the families you help." Dr. Carter handed him a cup of coffee. "Tomorrow, you'll meet some of my colleagues. Doctors from different backgrounds, all working toward the same goal. Are you ready to learn more?" Sullivan looked at the empty cup in his hands, then at the busy hospital corridor outside. "You know what? For the first time in my career, I think I really am ready to learn." As they walked out of the consultation room, the hospital continued its endless rhythm of saving lives, unaware that it was saving something else too: one police officer's understanding of the world. A month into the program, Sullivan sat in the hospital's break room, flipping through a photo album Dr. Carter had shared. Each page told stories of her journey, graduation photos, her first surgery, award ceremonies, and countless pictures with grateful patients and their families. "That was my first brain tumor removal," Dr. Carter said, pointing to a photo where she stood next to a beaming elderly patient. 16 hours in surgery. Everyone said it was impossible. But here she is, 5 years later, still baking cookies for our staff. Sullivan paused at a particular image: Dr. Carter as a young medical student, standing proud despite being the only woman of color in her class photo. "Must have been tough," he remarked quietly. "It was," she admitted, pouring them both fresh coffee. "But every challenge taught me something. Like that time in residency when a patient refused to let me treat them. The attending physician that day, an older white doctor, did something remarkable. Instead of taking over, he told the patient, 'You're refusing care from the best neurosurgeon I've ever trained. That's your choice, but it's a mistake.'" Their conversation was interrupted by Sullivan's phone buzzing. He glanced at it, his face falling slightly. Some of the guys from the force, they think I've switched sides. They don't understand why I'm doing this. Change isn't easy for anyone, Dr. Carter replied. Remember my first day in Pine Valley? Even with all my achievements, people still saw what they expected to see. Just then, a nurse burst into the break room. Dr. Carter. Multi-car pileup on the highway. 6 incoming trauma patients, 2 with severe head injuries. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Sullivan watched from the observation room as Dr. Carter worked on multiple patients, moving between operating rooms with precision and focus. Her team followed her lead without question, their actions synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Late that night, as the emergency subsided, Sullivan found Dr. Carter in her office, finally taking a moment to rest. "You saved all of them," he said, still amazed. "We saved them," she corrected. "Every person in that OR, every nurse, every technician. We're a team. That's what I want you to understand, Officer Sullivan. When we look past our differences, when we trust each other's abilities, we can do incredible things." She pulled out a letter from her desk. This came today. That patient from last week, the one who couldn't afford the surgery, the hospital board approved the charity care funding. He's getting the operation he needs. Sullivan smiled, remembering how passionately she had argued for that patient's case. "You fight for everyone, don't you? Even people who've wronged you." "Speaking of fighting," she said, changing the subject, "how's your daughter's internship application coming along?" "She's almost finished it." "But," he hesitated, "she's worried her last name might work against her now, after everything that happened." Dr. Carter leaned back in her chair. "You know what I look for in applications. Not last names or backgrounds, but passion, dedication, and the willingness to learn. Tell her to submit it. Every application gets a fair review." As Sullivan left the hospital that evening, he passed the same security guard he'd been nodding to for weeks now. But this time, he stopped. "Hey," he said, extending his hand. "I don't think I ever properly introduced myself." The guard looked surprised, but shook his hand warmly. "Nice to finally meet you, officer. You know, we've been watching you these past weeks. The way you're trying to learn, to change, it gives us hope." Walking to his car under the starlit sky, Sullivan thought about how much had changed in just a month. The same hospital he once would have viewed with suspicion had become a place of learning and growth. And tomorrow would bring new lessons, new understanding, and perhaps most importantly, new chances to be better than he was yesterday. Life has a way of testing our growth when we least expect it. For Officer Sullivan, that test came on a rainy Tuesday evening when his phone rang during dinner. His daughter wasn't answering her phone, and the hospital had been trying to reach him. "Car accident on River Road," the nurse said. "Your daughter was brought in 20 minutes ago. She's stable, but—" The world seemed to blur as Sullivan raced to Metropolitan Hospital. The same halls he'd walked through during his training now felt endless. At the emergency room entrance, he nearly collided with a staff member. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "My daughter. They said she was brought in." "Mr. Sullivan," a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Dr. Carter walking quickly toward him, still in her surgical scrubs. His heart dropped. If she was involved, it had to be serious. "She has a subdural hematoma," Dr. Carter explained, using simpler terms when she saw his panic. "That means there's bleeding near her brain. We need to operate immediately." Sullivan felt his legs go weak. You'll be doing the surgery." Dr. Carter nodded, her face serious but confident. "I'm the best chance she has right now, but I need your consent for the operation." Time seemed to freeze as Sullivan stood there. Just 2 months ago, he doubted this woman could even own a house in his neighborhood. Now his daughter's life was in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. "She was working on her internship application when it happened," he said softly, his voice trembling. She wanted to be just like you. Dr. Carter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. And she will be. But first, we need to get her through this. Do I have your permission to operate? Sullivan looked into the eyes of the woman he once handcuffed in her own driveway. He saw no resentment there, only determination and compassion. Save my baby, he whispered. Please. The next few hours were the longest of Sullivan's life. He paced the waiting room, watched the clock, and prayed harder than he ever had before. Other officers from his precinct showed up to support him, including some who had criticized his participation in the hospital program. Dr. Carter, one officer said, shaking his head, "Never thought I'd say this, but there's no one I trust more right now." Finally, after what felt like eternity, Dr. Carter emerged from the operating room. Her surgical cap was still on, and her eyes showed fatigue, but she was smiling. "The surgery was successful," she announced. "Your daughter is going to make a full recovery." Sullivan broke down, tears flowing freely. Without thinking, he hugged Dr. Carter tightly. "Thank you," he sobbed. "Thank you for not being like me. Thank you for being better than I was." Dr. Carter returned the hug, her own eyes moist. "This is why we do what we do," she said softly. "Every life is precious, every person valuable. Your daughter proved that to you tonight, didn't she?" In the recovery room, Sullivan sat beside his sleeping daughter, holding her hand. On her bedside table lay her unfinished internship application. He picked it up, reading her personal statement through tear-blurred eyes. "I want to be a doctor who helps everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from." Dr. Carter stopped by for a final check before ending her shift. "She's strong," she observed, checking the monitors. "Just like her father." Sullivan shook his head. "I wasn't strong. I was afraid. Afraid of what was different, afraid of change. But not anymore." He looked at his daughter's peaceful face. "When she wakes up, I want her to be proud of who her father has become." As dawn broke over the hospital, casting long shadows through the recovery room windows, Sullivan realized that sometimes the greatest lessons come wrapped in our worst fears. His daughter was alive because of a woman he once would have mistrusted, and in saving her life, Dr. Carter had also saved something in him. 3 months after his daughter's surgery, Sullivan stood before a room full of police officers at the department's annual training conference. His hands were steady now as he adjusted the microphone, looking out at faces both skeptical and curious. "6 months ago, I was that officer," he began, his voice clear and strong. "The one who thought he knew everything. The one who saw threats where there were none. The one who almost ruined someone's life because of what I thought I knew." The projector behind him showed the viral video of Dr. Carter's arrest. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing themselves in his actions. But today, I'm here to tell you about what happened after that video ended. About a doctor who chose education over punishment. About a program that opened my eyes. And about the night that same doctor saved my daughter's life. He clicked to the next slide. A photo of his daughter in her hospital bed, smiling weakly with Dr. Carter beside her. This woman, whom I once handcuffed in front of her own home, spent 6 hours in surgery saving my child. And do you know what she said to me afterward? "Every life is precious." In the back of the room, Dr. Carter sat quietly, watching as Sullivan shared their story. She'd been invited as a guest speaker, but this part was all his. "We talk about instincts in our line of work," Sullivan continued. "But how many of those instincts are actually prejudices in disguise? How many times do we see threats instead of people?" He pulled out his daughter's acceptance letter to the hospital's internship program. "My daughter starts her medical internship next month. She'll be working alongside people from all walks of life, learning to save lives without judgment. And you know what? She's taught me more about being a good police officer than my 20 years on the force." The room was silent now, every officer fully engaged. Sullivan shared stories from his time at the hospital, The emergency room cases, the teamwork he witnessed, the lives saved by people he once would have viewed with suspicion. We took an oath to protect and serve, he reminded them. But you can't protect people you don't understand. You can't serve a community you've already judged. Dr. Carter stood up then, walking to join him at the podium. Together, they announced their new initiative, a partnership between the police department and the hospital, expanding the program that had changed Sullivan's life. This isn't just sensitivity training, Sullivan explained. It's about real connections, real understanding. It's about seeing people as people first. After the presentation, officers lined up to sign up for the program. Some shared their own stories of bias, of moments they weren't proud of wanting to be better. In his office later that day, Sullivan hung a new photo next to his badge, his daughter in her intern's coat, standing proudly beside Dr. Carter. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the officers who'd attended the training. "You changed how I see things, Sully. Never thought I'd say that, but you did." Dr. Carter stopped by as he was leaving. "Ready for tomorrow's ride along?" she asked. Part of their expanded program included having medical professionals shadow police officers, creating a two-way street of understanding. "You know," Sullivan replied, locking his office door, "6 months ago, I would have hated this idea. Now, I can't wait to show you what good policing really looks like." As they walked out together, they passed the precinct's newest recruitment poster. It showed officers and medical staff working side by side, with words that Sullivan himself had chosen: serving together, understanding always. The sunset painted the sky in shades of hope as they left the station, two people who'd started as antagonists, now walking forward as partners in change. Sometimes, Sullivan thought, the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments of understanding. 1 year after that fateful morning in Pine Valley, the community gathered in the hospital's grand conference room. The space was packed with police officers, medical staff, community leaders, and residents, all there to celebrate the first anniversary of the Bridge program, as they'd come to call it. Sullivan stood at the podium, looking much different from the officer he'd been a year ago. His daughter sat in the front row, now halfway through her internship, beaming with pride. Dr. Carter stood beside him, ready to share their success story. "When I look back at who I was that morning," Sullivan began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "I hardly recognized that person. I was an officer who thought he was protecting his community, but I was actually dividing it." He gestured to a large screen showing statistics from their first year. Over 200 officers had completed the program, complaints of bias had dropped by 60%, and community trust ratings had soared. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Sullivan continued. "Let me tell you about Officer Thompson, who saved a young man's life last month because he stopped to listen instead of jumping to conclusions. Or about Dr. Lee, who now rides along with our night patrol, helping us better handle mental health crisis calls." Dr. Carter stepped forward then, sharing her perspective. "This program wasn't born from anger or revenge," she explained. "It came from a belief that understanding is more powerful than punishment. That change is possible when we open our hearts and minds." The screen behind them showed photos from the past year. Officers attending medical rounds, doctors participating in police training, community meetings where both groups shared their experiences and learned from each other. "Last week," Sullivan shared, his voice softening, "my daughter performed her first assisted surgery. Dr. Carter supervised her as she helped save a police officer's wife. That officer was one of the men who'd criticized me for joining this program. After the surgery, he hugged both my daughter and Dr. Carter, crying and thanking them." The audience listened intently as more success stories were shared. The program had spread to neighboring districts, with other departments and hospitals requesting to implement similar initiatives. "But our proudest achievement," Dr. Carter announced, "is what we see in our everyday interactions." She pointed to the back of the room, where Mrs. Chen from Pine Valley was chatting comfortably with 2 police officers, the same ones who used to patrol her neighborhood with suspicion. Sullivan's voice cracked slightly as he continued, "My grandson was born last month. When I look at him, I see hope. Hope that he'll grow up in a community where people don't judge each other based on appearances or assumptions, where those who protect and those who heal work together to build something better." As the presentation concluded, the room erupted in applause. But the real magic happened afterward, as people mingled freely. Officers and doctors sharing stories, community members offering suggestions, and new participants signing up for the program. In a quiet moment, Sullivan found himself standing with Dr. Carter near the window, watching the sunset over the city they'd both helped to change. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "that morning could have ended so differently. A lawsuit, a fired officer, more anger, more division." Dr. Carter smiled, watching Sullivan's daughter explain medical terms to a group of interested officers. "Sometimes the worst moments bring out the best possibilities," she replied. "Look around. Every person in this room has a story of change, of growth, of understanding." As evening fell over the city, the conference room remained full of hope and conversation. The Bridge program had done more than just connect two professions. It had shown that change was possible, that understanding could triumph over prejudice, and that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with a single act of courage and forgiveness. Sullivan looked at his watch. He had a night shift starting soon, but now it felt different. Each patrol was an opportunity to serve, to understand, to be the change he wished he'd seen in himself so many years ago. And somewhere in the city, lives would be saved tonight by people who had learned to see beyond their prejudices, all because one doctor chose understanding over anger, and one officer chose growth over pride.